Hello and welcome to this video that we are going to cover how to deeply connect with a fearful avoidant attachment style. And basically, what you're about to see is a clip from one of our webinars that's all about how to deeply connect with a fearful avoidant through the means of bypassing their core wounds. So, if you're not already familiar, the core wounds that overlap with the attachment styles is a really powerful part of our body of work called integrated attachment theory that we published back in 2018. And essentially, in this very specific clip of the webinar, it will show you the different core wounds that the fearful avoidant has and how to communicate in a way that you're not going to be hitting them, rubbing up against them, causing more friction or conflict. And I'll say this, just like I said throughout the webinar, which is that your job isn't to be perfect if you're the loved one of a fearful avoidant. But when we learn more about the people we love, we can better take them into consideration and just be mindful about certain things. And of course, if you are the fearful avoidant, these are such empowering things for you to know about yourself and share with your partner or loved ones. So this will be a clip from the webinar. If you want to see the full webinar, you can actually use the link down below in the description box to see the full webinar. It's about an hour and a half. It's actually an hour and 50 minutes long, I believe. And it's all about all the ways to deeply connect with a fearful avoidant, basically all the things that a fearful avoidant really needs to thrive in a romantic relationship. Everything from building trust to moving through core wounds, through communicating through conflict, learning healthier forms of communication in general, learning healthier coping mechanisms. And we really talk about all these different things, even in regards to boundaries or needs is a huge part, and how to move through these things from a place of understanding yourself if you are the FA and how powerful and potent these things are. And if you are the loved one of an FA, all these things you need to know for the power struggle stage of a relationship, which will come up to be moved through, so that you can actually keep the relationship on a track to lasting, to working, and really to thriving, because that should be the ultimate goal. So I hope you enjoy this clip. I hope you enjoy the webinar. If you get a chance to check it out, again, it's free for 7 days using the link below. And I am in here making daily videos on YouTube. If you enjoy this channel, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Some of the big core wounds of the fearful avoidant attachment style are I will be betrayed, I am unsafe, I am unworthy, I am bad. I know when we go through these, it feels like, oh my gosh, there's so many core wounds. But remember, when you go into the emotional mastery and belief reprogramming course, you can reprogram core wounds in a very short period of time. You can do 2 at a time, you can double them up. And once you get through a couple, it sort of has this ripple out effect where it diminishes a lot of other core wounds. So I will be betrayed, I am unsafe. And again, fearful avoidants don't usually realize that they feel unsafe, because usually what's happening instead is they're so busy compensating for feeling unsafe through the 4 Fs that we talked about earlier: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, that it's they don't even realize they feel unsafe because they're too busy over defending themselves, fleeing the scene, freezing, people pleasing, until they become frustrated and upset. So, there tends to be this not even realizing that they feel that way. But if you look at your behaviors, you'll see that, wow, I must feel that way because I seem to constantly be compensating for feeling unsafe. And I may not notice that I emotionally allow that because there wasn't room for you to feel that emotion as a child. Usually you didn't have time for that. You had to pivot, adapt, figure it out, show up. And so there wasn't really that emotion of oh, I feel afraid. Fearful avoidants don't tend to really be fearful people, but they're really good at coping from fear, and they seem to be stuck in the coping. If you look at those 4 Fs, right? Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So you'll see a lot of these different dynamics. Also, same thing with unworthiness. You may not be oh, you may not even realize sometimes that our next 2 core wounds are unworthy and bad. You may not realize, you may not be in touch with feelings of unworthiness. You might sometimes when you get triggered, but feelings of being bad. If you feel chronic guilt, if you feel guilty about everything, you have an I am bad core wound. Okay. If you are over guilting yourself about all these little small things all over the map, you have an I am bad core wound. If you are coming from a position of feeling I need to constantly earn my worth, prove my worth, over deliver in my friendships, over deliver in my romantic relationships, over deliver in all these places, I can't make any mistakes and hurt anybody ever in any relationship that I'm in. If you're coming from that space of extreme perfectionism in your relationships, you probably have an unworthiness core wound there too. right? So it's important to sort of notice some of these things. If you don't consciously feel them, they could still really be a part of your behavioral coping mechanisms. Another big thing, fearful avoidants obviously have a fear of being abandoned, trapped, helpless, powerless, out of control. The place you're going to see that the most. So notice this, okay? As a fearful avoidant, when you feel frustrated, you probably have an I am trapped or I am helpless wound triggered. Okay. Like down to little things. Like I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day who's for sure a fearful avoidant. Um, and she got locked in her room. Like she had one of her children locked her in this room by accident. It was this whole thing. And she had to go to work. And she said she was like so frustrated. And those little situations for fearful avoidance can just make them feel so trapped, right? So helpless, so powerless. To somebody else, it's like if somebody's securely attached, they might go, oh, this is really frustrating. This isn't good. I'm going to call work, let them know I'm going to be late, and I'm going to have to just surrender, call a locksmith, do whatever, call a neighbor, call a friend over to help me get out of this room. But for her, like you could tell it was just such a triggering situation, but it's usually because of those, like, I am trapped, I am helpless core wounds underneath there that can really have that strong feeling and output. And again, where do you think this comes from, right? If you grow up in a household where there's chaos and you can't escape, you can't get your needs met. I mean, it's just this like ongoing subtle conditioning of feeling trapped, right? If you're feeling like you're in that situation. Another big thing is how this will tend to show up the most for fearful avoidance is how scared fearful avoidants are of relying on other people. It was so interesting. I had a lot of conversations over the years with fearful avoidance about like, what is your worst fear ever? And a lot of the output, like a lot of those conversations would be like, if I had to completely rely on people for the rest of my life, like if I was like just at the mercy of somebody else all the time, like that would keep me up at night. Like that is this horrible fear. And again, like where that comes from is if you grow up in a household where that's your reality, and then like it's a very uncomfortable experience, you're just afraid of going back to that again, right? There's just that underlying fear that's there. And again, like nobody wants to be in a situation where they have to rely on somebody and can't look out for themselves or take care of themselves or things like that. But, we can still have a great life being in a situation like that. And when a fearful avoidant is like, oh my gosh, that's the most terrifying thing ever. Part of it is because of like your relationship to those experiences from the past. And if you're feeling that way, you can guarantee that is largely you not feeling safe to rely on people probably much at all, right? If you're like, that's the biggest fear of my life, then, if that's this huge thing. And I saw a lot of head nod when I said that. So if you're really feeling that, then it's probably scary for you to like rely on somebody in an interdependent way, which is the goal of secure attachment, to be able to have people look out for you, to be able to know that people have your back, that you can open up, that you can be vulnerable, you can let people in, that you can soothe through others, that you can ask people for favors when you're close to them and be okay with that, or ask somebody for help with something and be okay with receiving it, right? And again, if you're terrified in these extreme cases, like, oh my gosh, that's the scariest thing ever. Again, terrified in those extreme cases, probably if you dig a little bit deeper, you probably struggle in your relationship to receiving. So receiving compliments, receiving love, receiving affection, receiving support, we could go all through the list in all 7 areas of life. And that'll be what your work to do, is to be able to do that. It feels really nice to get good at that. It feels healthy to get good at that. It makes relationships feel more connected and more safe to get good at that. So really important to pay attention. Sorry, I just saw one comment in the chat from Tess. Thais, what does the constant feeling of overwhelmed mean? Absolutely, Angela. Out of control or powerless. Also, it can be like the result of a dysregulated nervous system in there as well, right? Constantly fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode. Like just you're on the hamster wheel all the time. And then out of control, powerless, helpless. And the sense of feeling really stuck. And from a behavioral level, guess when we tend to feel like this the most? When we have poor boundaries. So if you're constantly feeling overwhelmed, pressured, all these different things, chances are you're not doing the best job at taking yourself into consideration and setting up healthy boundaries in your life. And wherever you're feeling overwhelmed around, that's probably the boundary issue area to focus on. So, for example, what overwhelms you? Is it your relationships? Is it your work? Is it, friendship relationships, romantic relationships? Like, what is it? And that's probably the place that you need boundaries the most. So important to pay attention to. So, other smaller core wounds fearful avoidance have, I'm not good enough can be in there. I am unloved, or people don't care about me, or I don't matter. Those can definitely be in there. That goes back to like that imbalance feeling that we talked about earlier. I am weak can be a big one. I am weak if I'm too vulnerable. Again, like vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability in our world here today is courageous. And I think if we take an honest look, we would see that your subconscious mind will tell you otherwise because it's been conditioned in a certain way. But opening up and doing that is a huge part of courage. And then one other one that can come up for fearful avoidance a lot, and here's where we'll see the strong fight response from a fearful avoidant, not always, but a lot of the time, is I am disrespected. It's a good one for a fearful avoidance to work on and work through. But like I've heard a lot of fearful avoidants over the years be like, I am disrespected. They disrespect me. That can be a big trigger point. Sometimes because if we take a big, honest look, and this isn't everybody's experience, but a lot of fearful avoidants tend to have like a dynamic along these lines, is that if you grew up in a home where parents were big and scary and they did whatever they want and they spoke to you however they want, and and they kind of get away with it, sometimes because the subconscious mind's always trying to equilibrate or balance out. Sometimes in our adult lives, like if somebody comes along and they talk to you in a similar way, where like as a child you were so helpless to do anything about it, sometimes we're almost like trying to take our power back, not just from the person or situation in front of us, but from the history of all the times that we couldn't. And so sometimes, like when a fearful avoidant feels disrespected, they might like snap back like 10x because, there's a history there of feeling a lot of pain and suffering. And it's almost like, I'm taking my power back. I'm done with feeling this way. And again, what do we know? I mean, we know that this is how triggering works, right? We know that like your subconscious mind's like this big filing cabinet. It stores all your information and memories and emotions. And so if you have a long history of feeling a certain way, and then somebody reminds you of that in present day, then what you're experiencing is your conscious mind kind of communicates to your subconscious in a way, and it's like, well, how is this familiar? This feels familiar. And the subconscious opens its whole filing cabinet and dumps out all the emotion from all those past experiences and says, you felt all of this disrespect in the past. And now in your interaction with that person in front of you, you're not just interacting with the present, you're interacting with the present combined with all of those past emotions, memories, experiences that are being dumped up in that moment, right? That's what a trigger is for all versions of a trigger, whether it's abandonment triggering or feeling trapped triggering. So a lot of these things can be important to pay attention to. It's so interesting as well because fearful avoidance in relationships. So when we talk about these core wounds, we'll talk about how to like kind of bypass them in relationships if you're the loved one of an FA. But when we talk about these core wounds, it's also important to recognize that some of these things will lead to just pain points, big challenges in relationships like this. These are going to be the places where the fearful avoidant kind of like butts heads with someone else. And if we can, make sure that we know how to just bypass these things ahead of time, it makes relating with the fearful avoidant so much more smooth. And if you are the FA, these are important things to keep in mind and even share with your partner or loved ones. So for example, like if you have this big wound around betrayal, well, what's the opposite of betrayal? Well, trust, loyalty, feeling cherished, cared about, right? So let's just look at trust. So what is trust made up of? Consistency, consideration, congruency. Okay. Fearful avoidants are lie detectors. So if there is something that is like out of congruency, the fearful avoidant will know it and they're not even going to be consciously looking for it. They just are going to pick it up without noticing anything. Lots of lie detectors in here. So it's just how it works. So when there's an incongruency in something, the more you can just bring transparency there and explain the incongruency, you're going to avoid a lot of arguments. Okay. So, and if you are the fearful avoidant and you see somebody being incongruent with you, tell them, Just say very nicely, "Hey, I tend to pick up a lot on incongruencies, and I just noticed that like you shared the story and then the story changed quickly, and I'm not trying to give you a hard time about it, but I really would love to understand. Like, can you bring some understanding to me? Can you bring some transparency?" Don't do this with like your boss, but do this with like the people close to you in your life, right? This isn't this isn't like have the conversation with people you don't know that well. But if this is somebody you're living with, it's a parent you're trying to repair a relationship with, it's a sibling that you're super close to, it's somebody you're dating, it's somebody like, then we have to be asking those questions, because I guarantee what will happen instead if you don't is you'll try to suppress it. You'll walk away from the situation. Your brain will go, 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 go. And then an hour later, you're going to get really upset about something totally unrelated in the relationship. And it doesn't do anything productive for you. And it doesn't do anything productive for that person or the relationship. So you have like a very important high responsibility to yourself to be doing this, to be asking these questions, to be having these conversations, to ask for in your relationships transparency, openness. If your lie detector like beeping system comes online, you sense something is off, you're feeling it, you're noticing it, it's like happening, you have to address it. Okay. And you actually have a duty to yourself to address it. Just learn to address it in a healthy way. And what will actually happen, it's very healing, is that instead of trying to repress all those things, because you're not going to be able to change that you notice it. Instead, I'll tell you from a personal perspective, actually. So I realize this very strongly about myself, and I can't help it. Like, I'm sure I could sit down and try to reprogram being hypervigilant, but I kind of like the upsides of it, right? And so I don't mind. I'm very, very hypervigilant. I just notice all the little things. But it's not from this like dysregulated nervous system space. It's just that the noticing is always there. And when I met my now husband, 8 years ago or whatever it was, I realized pretty early on that like I had to address those things or I was going to get resentful. And I'd done a lot of work and healing already, like a lot for like the 4 years or so before. But I definitely hadn't done that healing like in a romantic relationship too much yet. So I just told him like pretty early on that, hey, I'm kind of this way. I kind of notice everything. And something that's going to help me not get to a point of like arguing with you about stuff is going to be if I can ask you if I see little patterns of inconsistencies, or if you can just like let me talk about it. And like, I'm not coming from a place, if I do this, of like accusing you. I'm coming from a place of just like needing transparency so I can understand. And I kind of like set that out early on. And then like little things would happen. And I would just say, hey, like I just noticed this from this. And like, I'm not upset about it. Can you just explain it? I just want to understand. Or even if it was like in a fight or an argument or something where like it was like one thing was said and then another thing was said, I'd be like, hey, I really need to know, like I'm upset about this thing. I really need to know why you did what you did. I really need to understand it. Or hey, I'm kind of like taking the situation personally. Can you help me understand it so I'm not doing that? And I would just ask for transparency, ask these questions a lot. And like, fast forward all these years later, like sometimes I notice stuff and like my brain does this thing on like almost like in these steps. It's so interesting is like, I'll notice an incongruency, and then my brain's like it's not even like important to me to bring up because I have so much trust there. Like if a pattern change, instead of me assuming, which I used to in the past, like these big, big things, and then would have to talk about them, my brain kind of naturally drops them because I have so much trust that I almost am like, oh, my incongruency is probably something so unrelated that's not important that it's not a big deal. And if it was important or I thought it was a bad thing or a threatening thing, I would absolutely address it. But like a lot of times there's just been so much trust established over the years. If something shifted, I'm like, oh, maybe he just forgot, or maybe he's having a tired day, or maybe, and my brain kind of goes there instead naturally. So that's like the result of doing that work over time is like when you ask for these things that help you to rebuild trust, eventually you can rebuild so much trust that your brain doesn't go to these like worst case scenario assumptions, and it will help to kind of recondition that dynamic over time. So I hope that makes sense. And it won't ever, just for the record, for the fearful avoidance, we're like, no, I will then lose the red flags and I will miss out on things and I will then be betrayed. I don't want to do that. The more you have these conversations, the more empowered you will feel if there is something bothering you to just naturally address it so you can truly get to the bottom of it in a healthy way. And then you can choose how to respond from that place forward. So very, very valuable to practice that. So That's around the betrayal core wound. Of course, fearful avoidance, you want to be reprogramming that wound. You want to be reprogramming trust and the relationship to yourself. If you're the loved one of a fearful avoidant as well, I mean, like a great thing that I think fearful avoidants really appreciate is ask them, like, are you being boundaryless? Do you have boundaries in this situation? Again, it's not your job, but sometimes if you're somebody really close to them and you might see that they're not being great with their boundaries, just reminding them or checking in. So, like, I'll give you an example. I was working with a couple and they were engaged, and the female was fearful avoidant and the male was, I think he was mostly secure with a little bit of AP. Um, and anyway, she was a pretty big fearful avoidant, but they really like cared about each other, really loved each other, planning on getting married. And they were in this situation where she was making more money than he was. And she would kind of pay for more things all the time. And then it came up in counseling that it upset her. And she wanted to like have more equality. And she's like, I don't mind paying for stuff a little more, but like, I need him to like kind of step up more. And then he came into a session one time and he's like, we do this thing now where I offer all the time when we go out to dinner to pay for stuff. And she always says, no, no, no. And he's like, so what am I supposed to do? And instead he's like, so the last time I was like, hey, are you just doing this from like an instinct? Cause you just like have this compulsion to give. And like, are you not having a boundary? Like, am I supposed to know that and read that? And if so, like, can you just let me pay for dinner? And, it's not his responsibility if we're being really honest in that moment. But if somebody really knows you and is connected to you and they're supporting you and they show up and they poke at you a little when they know that you're doing an old habit, that can be a great way of supporting that person. And she came into the session, she was really happy about it. And she felt very like seen and known and understood and all those sorts of things. So again, not to put over responsibility on the other person, because each person's really responsible for their 50% of the relationship. But when we can do these little things in an interdependent way where we're extra considerate of things, especially things that people are working through, it can go a very, very long way.